The sun bathed the city in its warm glow. But for Mayor Daniel Wright, it was just another day of relentless dedication. Daniel, a visionary leader and the city's first black mayor, had always believed in leading by example. His policies had transformed crumbling neighborhoods, revitalized education, and provided opportunities for the marginalized. But today, he chose a different approach: anonymity. He left his office suit behind, donning a simple hoodie and jeans, and decided to visit the bustling Maplewood shopping center as an ordinary citizen. His intention was clear: understand firsthand the daily struggles his people faced. The mall, a vibrant hub of activity, was alive with the hum of conversations and the occasional cries of children tugging at their parents' hands. Daniel meandered through the shops, observing the stark contrast between the polished storefronts and the weary expressions of employees inside. He stopped at a modest electronics store, drawn by the display of headphones he'd considered buying for his son. As he reached for a pair, a sharp voice broke his concentration. "Hey, you planning on paying for that?" Daniel turned to see a white police officer standing a few feet away. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed, the badge gleamed on his chest. But his tone carried an edge of hostility that turned heads. Shoppers paused, their curiosity piqued. "Excuse me?" Daniel replied, his voice steady but puzzled. The officer, identified by the name tag, Officer Randall Stone, took a step closer, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "Don't play dumb. I saw you acting suspiciously. You're trying to steal." A ripple of tension passed through the crowd. Daniel's heart sank, not out of fear, but at the realization of what this was. Over the years, he had seen stories like this play out in his city. But now he was the one in the crosshairs. "I'm just browsing," Daniel said calmly, raising his hand slightly, a universal gesture of de-escalation. But Stone wasn't interested in de-escalation. "Browsing? Right. Hood up, hands all over the merchandise. You people think you can get away with anything." The words, "you people," hung in the air like a foul odor. The crowd murmured, some recording on their phones. Daniel caught the glint of a camera lens but kept his composure. He wouldn't give Stone the satisfaction of anger. "Officer, I'm happy to show you my ID if that would help clarify." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Stone barked, cutting him off. His voice grew louder, his stance more menacing. "Turn around, hands on your head, now." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Someone shouted, "You can't do that." He didn't do anything, but Stone ignored them. He grabbed Daniel by the arm with a force that made him stumble. Twisting his arm behind his back, pain shot through Daniel's shoulder. But he clenched his jaw. "Officer, I think you're making a mistake," Daniel said, his voice strained but controlled. Stone laughed, a sharp, derisive sound. "The only mistake here is you thinking you're above the law." The next moment happened in a blur. Stone shoved Daniel to the ground, his knee pressing into his back. A sickening thud echoed as Daniel's face hit the cold tile floor. Blood trickled from his lip where it had split. The crowd erupted, some pleading with Stone to stop, others capturing every agonizing second on their phones. "Get back," Stone yelled at the crowd, his hand now on his weapon. "Or you're next." As Daniel lay pinned to the ground, flashes of his life flickered through his mind, his first campaign speech. The long nights drafting reform policies. The community rallies where he promised his constituents he would protect them. And now, here he was, helpless and humiliated, reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in the eyes of a man who had sworn to serve and protect. It was only when another officer arrived that Stone loosened his grip. The second officer looked between Daniel and Stone, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "What's going on here?" "Caught this guy trying to shoplift," Stone said smugly, standing up and dusting off his hands. The second officer glanced at Daniel, his eyes widening slightly. "Wait, is that?" Before he could finish, Daniel slowly pushed himself up, blood still trickling from his lip. His voice, though soft, carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around them. "I'm Daniel Wright. I'm the mayor of this city." The world seemed to freeze. Stone's smug expression crumbled as the realization hit him. His face turned ashen, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. The second officer took a step back, his hand covering his mouth in shock. The crowd erupted in disbelief and anger. "He's the mayor? Are you kidding me?" shouted one bystander. Phones were raised higher, capturing Stone's stunned expression as the mayor, bloodied but unbroken, stood tall. For a moment, Stone seemed paralyzed by fear. But the damage was done. Daniel turned to the crowd, his voice steady despite the turmoil. I appreciate your concern, but let's remain peaceful. This isn't just about me, it's about justice for everyone. His words were met with cheers and applause. But Daniel knew this was just the beginning. Stone's actions had revealed more than his prejudice. They had exposed a deep-rooted sickness within the system he was sworn to uphold. As Daniel wiped the blood from his face, he silently vowed that this moment of humiliation would not be in vain. The fight for justice had just become personal, and he would stop at nothing to ensure no one else would endure what he had just experienced. The wheels of change had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed faintly as Officer Randall Stone marched his prisoner through the narrow corridors. His grip on the mayor's arm still tight, as if trying to assert the last vestiges of control. Daniel Wright, the mayor of the city, bore it all with quiet dignity. His face ached from the blow. His lips still oozed blood. But his mind churned, not with anger, but resolve. This moment, though deeply humiliating, was a stark revelation of the very struggle he had dedicated his life to combating. The holding area was dim and reeked of sweat and despair. Stone shoved Daniel toward a bench without ceremony, muttering under his breath, "Let's see how tough you act when we process you." Daniel sat silently, his calm demeanor unsettling the officer more than any resistance could have. His gaze was steady, piercing through the haze of humiliation and focusing on the bigger picture. Around him, the usual noise of the precinct, a cacophony of ringing phones, hurried footsteps, and barked orders, seemed to recede into the background. The desk sergeant looked up as Stone approached. "What have we got?" "Caught this guy shoplifting at the mall," Stone said, his tone dripping with smug confidence. "He resisted, so I had to use force." The sergeant raised an eyebrow, glancing over at Daniel. "Doesn't look like your average thief." "Trust me," Stone said dismissively. "These people are good at blending in." Daniel could have spoken then. He could have revealed his identity and stopped this farce in its tracks. But he didn't. Not yet. He wanted to see it unfold, wanted to understand just how deep the rot went. Instead, he sat quietly, observing, absorbing, waiting. The sergeant sighed, beginning the intake process. "Name?" For the first time, Daniel spoke. His voice was low but carried the weight of authority. "Daniel Wright." The sergeant frowned, his pen hovering above the form. "Daniel Wright?" He glanced up, his brow furrowing. "Wait, as in?" Stone rolled his eyes, cutting in. "Don't let him fool you. These guys will say anything to get out of trouble." But the sergeant didn't seem convinced. He leaned closer, studying Daniel's face. Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of horror. "Holy, you're the mayor." The room fell silent. Stone froze, the color draining from his face as if the air had been sucked out of the room. His hand twitched at his side, his mind scrambling to process what he had just heard. The sergeant rose from his chair abruptly, his demeanor shifting from casual indifference to a mix of panic and respect. "Mr. Mayor, I didn't realize." Daniel held up a hand, silencing the sergeant's stammered apologies. "I'd like to make a phone call," he said simply, his voice devoid of anger but filled with an unspoken command. The sergeant nodded quickly, motioning toward a phone on the wall. As Daniel rose, Stone's mouth finally found words. This is some kind of mistake. You didn't say anything. How was I supposed to know?" Daniel turned to face him, his calm gaze locking onto Stone's frantic eyes. "Why should my identity change how you treat me?" he asked, his tone cutting through the silence like a blade. "Would you have acted differently if I were just another black man walking through that mall?" Stone opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his bravado shattered. Daniel didn't wait for an answer. He walked to the phone and dialed a number, his fingers steady despite the tumult of emotions swirling within him. The line clicked, and a familiar voice answered. "Daniel, where are you? What happened?" It was Susan Miller, his chief of staff, her voice laced with concern. "I'm at the precinct," he replied evenly. "I need you to come down here with our legal team immediately. There's been an incident." The weight in his voice spoke volumes. Susan didn't press for details. "We're on our way." Daniel hung up and returned to the bench. His presence now a storm cloud hanging over the room. Stone stood frozen in place, his mind racing. The smug confidence he had displayed earlier had dissolved into a cocktail of fear and confusion. He tried to speak, to justify his actions, but the words tangled in his throat. The sergeant, meanwhile, busied himself with futile attempts to restore order. "Mr. Mayor, I apologize for." "Save it," Daniel interrupted, his voice sharp. "Your apology means nothing if this is how your department operates." The next hour passed in tense silence. Daniel sat motionless, his calm exterior masking the turmoil within. He replayed the events in his mind, the officer's condescension, the unnecessary violence, the dismissive tone. It wasn't new, it wasn't even surprising, but it was personal now. And he would use that. When Susan arrived, she brought not only the city's best lawyers but a swarm of reporters who had caught wind of the incident. Cameras flashed, and questions flew as Daniel stepped out of the precinct. His face bruised but his resolve unshaken. He faced the press directly, his voice steady as he addressed the city. "Today, I experienced firsthand what far too many of our citizens endure daily: harassment, violence, and humiliation at the hands of those sworn to protect us. Let me be clear, this isn't about me. This is about a system that allows this behavior to thrive. It's about every black man, woman, and child who has ever been treated as less than. And it stops now." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers. But Daniel's focus remained on the cameras, his message clear and unwavering. Stone watched from the precinct doorway, his face pale, knowing his actions had set into motion something far greater than he could have imagined. As Daniel stepped into the awaiting car, his mind raced with plans. He would not let this incident fade into a fleeting headline. It was a turning point, a catalyst for the change he had always envisioned. And while Stone's actions had revealed his own prejudice, they had also unveiled the deeper sickness within the department. A sickness Daniel was now more determined than ever to cure. The echo of the press conference reverberated throughout the city. News outlets replayed Daniel Wright's words on a loop, his battered face becoming a rallying cry for change. The mayor had not just spoken to his constituents that day, he had ignited a movement. But Daniel knew speeches were not enough. Words could spark action. But it was evidence, hard, irrefutable truth, that would dismantle the corruption he now knew ran deeper than he had feared. His resolve was unshakable. The system that allowed Officer Randall Stone's actions to flourish would be exposed, no matter the cost. That evening, Daniel convened a meeting with his most trusted advisors in the privacy of his office. The air was heavy with urgency. Susan Miller, his chief of staff, stood at the head of the table, her laptop open, papers scattered before her. To her left sat Elijah Grant, a seasoned civil rights attorney who had fought, and won, cases against police misconduct for decades. Next to him was Camille Torres, a fiery data analyst with a knack for uncovering patterns buried in mountains of statistics. The room hummed with purpose. Daniel addressed them, his voice firm despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "What happened to me is a symptom of something much larger. We've known for years that there's a culture of unchecked power in this city's police force. Now we have an opportunity to prove it. I want to know everything, every complaint, every cover-up, every instance where justice was denied. And I want it fast." Elijah leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "You're talking about dismantling a system that's been entrenched for decades. It won't be easy. The unions will fight us tooth and nail. The department will stonewall us at every turn. I'm not looking for easy." Daniel replied, "I'm looking for justice." Camille nodded, her fingers already flying across her keyboard. "I can start with the complaint database. If there's a pattern, I'll find it." Susan chimed in, her tone pragmatic. "We'll need whistleblowers, people inside the department willing to talk. Without first-hand accounts, the public will see this as a political vendetta." Daniel's eyes darkened. "There are good officers in that department. I know there are, but they're afraid to speak out. We need to give them a reason to trust us." The team dispersed, each person carrying a piece of the monumental task ahead. Over the next several days, Camille worked tirelessly, poring over years of records. What she found was staggering. Complaint after complaint detailed instances of excessive force, racial profiling, and intimidation. Many of the officers involved had faced no consequences. Their files instead marked with phrases like, "investigation closed," or "insufficient evidence." And at the center of it all was a familiar name, Randall Stone. Camille presented her findings at their next meeting. Stone has over a dozen complaints against him, most involving Black and Latino civilians. None resulted in disciplinary action. But here's the kicker. Several of those complaints were dismissed by the same internal investigator, Captain Marcus Reed. Elijah whistled low. Reed's been in the department for over 20 years. If he's involved in covering for Stone, there's no telling how deep this goes. Daniel nodded grimly. Reed's our key. If we can connect him to a wider pattern of misconduct, we can blow this whole thing open. Meanwhile, Susan began reaching out to potential whistleblowers. It was a delicate process. Officers who wanted to speak out risked not just their careers but their safety. After weeks of persistent calls and quiet meetings in out-of-the-way coffee shops, one officer finally agreed to talk. His name was Officer James Porter, a young patrolman who had joined the force with idealistic dreams of serving his community but had quickly grown disillusioned. Porter's voice trembled as he recounted his experiences to Daniel and Elijah. "It's like an unspoken rule in the department," he said. "You don't cross certain people. Stone's one of them. Reed protects him, and anyone who tries to push back gets shut down. I've seen reports altered, evidence disappear. It's not just Stone. There's a whole network of guys like him. Why are you coming forward now?" Elijah asked gently. Porter hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Because I can't keep looking the other way." "What happened to you?" "Mayor Wright. That could have been anyone. If we don't fix this, it'll keep happening." Daniel placed a hand on Porter's shoulder. "Your courage won't be forgotten. We'll protect you." Porter's testimony was a breakthrough, but it also painted a chilling picture of the department's inner workings. Armed with his account, Susan and Camille dug deeper, uncovering a web of corruption that extended far beyond Stone. They found evidence of falsified reports, mishandled investigations, and a culture of impunity fostered by high-ranking officers like Reed. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was the whole tree. The tipping point came when Camille discovered an encrypted email thread between Reed and several officers, including Stone. The messages detailed coordinated efforts to intimidate witnesses, suppress complaints, and shield one another from accountability. It was the smoking gun they needed. Daniel's team compiled their findings into a comprehensive report, a damning indictment of the department's failings. But Daniel knew that exposing the truth would not be enough. He needed to bring it to the people and the courts. He called a press conference to unveil the report, standing before a sea of cameras and reporters. "Today, we lay bare the truth about the systemic failures within our police department," he began, his voice steady despite the gravity of his words. "This is not about one officer or one incident. This is about a culture that values power over accountability, silence over justice. And it ends now." The fallout was immediate. The public was outraged, demanding action. Reed and several other officers were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Stone, already facing criminal charges for his assault on Daniel, became the poster child for everything wrong with the department. But Daniel knew the battle was far from over. The police union issued a scathing statement, accusing him of vilifying officers and undermining public safety. Protests erupted, some supporting the mayor's reforms, others decrying them as anti-police. Through it all, Daniel remained resolute. He had exposed the system, but now he had to dismantle it. The path ahead would be fraught with resistance, but he had faith in the power of truth, and in the people who stood with him. This was only the beginning. Randall Stone sat in the dimly lit kitchen of his suburban home, his hands trembling as he lit yet another cigarette. The once pristine uniform hanging on the back of a chair now seemed like a relic of another life, a life that had come crashing down with the mayor's revelation. The weight of the headlines pressed down on him like a physical force. Racist cop assaults city mayor. Corruption unveiled in police force. And Randall Stone, a symbol of systemic rot. His face had been plastered across every screen in the city. His name spat with venom in protests and op-eds. He wasn't just fighting for his career now, he was fighting for survival. Stone's phone buzzed on the table, its harsh vibration breaking the oppressive silence. He hesitated before answering, recognizing the number. It was Captain Marcus Reed. The man who had always been there to clean up his messes now spoke with a tone that was cold and clipped. "You've dragged us all down with you, Stone," Reed said, his voice low and furious. Do you have any idea what's coming? Stone clenched his jaw, his mind racing. This isn't just on me. Captain, you think they won't come after you too? They already know about the complaints. The emails, everything. We're both in this. There was a pause, the weight of mutual guilt hanging heavy between them. Then Reed spoke again, his tone sharp. Listen to me carefully. If you go down, you do it alone. I've covered for you more times than I can count. And this is how you repay me? You better find a way to fix this before it's too late. The line went dead. Stone stared at the phone, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and fear. For years, Reed had been his safety net, burying complaints, manipulating evidence, and ensuring that nothing stuck. But now, with the mayor's investigation unraveling their carefully constructed web of deceit, that safety net was gone. Desperation clawed at Stone's mind, and he began to hatch a plan. If Reed wouldn't protect him, he would have to protect himself. He needed to erase the evidence, silence the voices, and rewrite the narrative before it consumed him entirely. The first step was to destroy the digital trail. Stone logged into an encrypted laptop he had used for unofficial communications with Reed and other officers. The emails Camille Torres had uncovered were still there, detailing years of cover-ups, coordinated stories, and even bribes to keep witnesses quiet. He began systematically deleting them, one by one, but his hands shook as he worked, and his paranoia grew with every passing second. He knew the mayor's team was far ahead of him. Those emails were likely already backed up somewhere, waiting to be exposed. His mind raced to the next phase of his plan, discrediting the investigation. If he could frame this as a politically motivated attack by the mayor, he might still have a chance. He called a local journalist known for his inflammatory takes and anti-reform rhetoric. Listen, Stone began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. The mayor's investigation is a sham. He's targeting me to score political points. And I have proof. The journalist bit immediately, sensing the opportunity for a sensational story. What kind of proof? I can show you the internal communications. Stone lied. The mayor's team is coordinating with activists to fabricate evidence against me. They're trying to dismantle the department for their own agenda. The journalist agreed to meet. But Stone knew this alone wouldn't be enough. He needed allies within the department, officers who would vouch for him and push back against the mayor's narrative. He called a small group of loyalists, officers who had benefited from Reed's protection and had as much to lose as he did. They met in a secluded bar on the edge of town. The atmosphere tense as Stone laid out his plan. We need to stick together, he said, his voice low but commanding. If we let the mayor tear us apart, we're all finished. But if we fight back, we can turn this around. One officer, a burly man named Carter, leaned forward. And what happens when they start looking at us? You think loyalty's gonna keep them from dragging me under? Stone slammed his fist on the table, his desperation boiling over. You think they'll stop at me? They're already coming for Reed. If we don't hold the line, none of us are safe. Carter exchanged a glance with the others, the unspoken fear uniting them. They nodded reluctantly, agreeing to stand by Stone, for now. But despite his efforts, Stone's paranoia grew. Reports of whistleblowers coming forward reached his ears. And the growing protests outside the precinct made it clear that public sentiment was against him. His face was a target, his name synonymous with everything the reform movement sought to dismantle. In his desperation, he turned to more drastic measures. He hired a private investigator to dig into Daniel Wright's past, hoping to uncover anything that could be used to discredit the mayor. The investigator returned empty-handed. Daniel's record was pristine, his reputation unassailable. Stone was running out of options. As the walls closed in, he made one last-ditch effort to save himself. He called Reed again, his voice shaking with barely concealed panic. We need to come clean together, he pleaded. If we expose the others, maybe we can cut a deal. Reed's response was icy. You don't get it, do you? You're a liability now. If it's between saving myself and saving you, I'll choose me every time. Stone's blood ran cold as the line went dead again. He was alone. In the days that followed, Daniel's team continued to dismantle the corrupt network piece by piece. More officers came forward, emboldened by the growing momentum of the investigation. Each new testimony added to the mountain of evidence against Stone, Reed, and their cohorts. Stone's attempts to cover his tracks crumbled under the weight of the truth. The emails he thought he had deleted were retrieved from encrypted servers. Witnesses who had been silenced by threats found their voices again. Even his allies within the department began to turn on him, seeking leniency in exchange for cooperation. By the time Stone was summoned for a formal deposition, he was a shadow of the man he had once been. The smug confidence, the sense of untouchable power, it was all gone. He sat across from Daniel Wright, who now faced him not as a victim, but as a leader seeking justice. "You thought you could bury the truth," Daniel said, his voice calm but steely. "But the truth has a way of rising to the surface." Stone didn't respond. He had no words left. His desperation had led him down a path of lies, betrayal, and self-destruction. Now, there was nothing left but to face the consequences. As Daniel left the room, he felt a sense of grim satisfaction. Stone's downfall was not just a personal victory, it was a step toward dismantling a system that had allowed men like him to thrive for too long. The fight was far from over. But Daniel knew one thing for certain: justice was no longer a distant dream. It was within reach. The glow of Daniel Wright's office seemed dimmer that evening. Despite the string of victories his team had achieved in exposing the corruption within the police department, the weight of the backlash was beginning to bear down on him. He sat alone at his desk, staring at the growing pile of documents that represented the battle ahead. Each one told a story: officers under investigation, legal challenges to his proposed reforms, and most troubling of all, threats against his family. The first threat had arrived just days after his press conference, a crudely written letter shoved under the front door of his home. The words were simple but chilling: "Back off, or your family will pay the price." At first, Daniel brushed it off, attributing it to a coward trying to intimidate him. But then came the phone calls. Late at night, a voice on the other end would whisper threats about his wife and son, always hanging up before the trace could complete. His security team had insisted on moving his family to a safer location. And though Daniel knew it was the right decision, the separation gnawed at him. He picked up his phone and dialed his wife. Monica, her voice, warm yet tinged with weariness, brought a brief sense of comfort. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. "I'm fine," Daniel replied, though he knew she could hear the strain in his voice. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "I know you think you're protecting us by keeping us out of the spotlight. But we're in this together." Daniel closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Monica had always been his rock, her unwavering support a source of strength in his darkest moments. "I know," he said finally, "and I promise, once this is over, I'll make things right for us." But as he hung up, Daniel knew the road ahead was anything but clear. The backlash against his reforms had taken on a life of its own, fueled by powerful forces determined to protect the status quo. The police union had launched a full-scale campaign against him, painting him as an anti-police radical intent on dismantling public safety. Ads flooded local media, showing crime scenes with ominous voiceovers. "Daniel Wright's war on police will make us all less safe." Daniel's political opponents seized the opportunity to undermine him. Council member Eric Lawson, a longtime critic of Daniel's administration, held a press conference denouncing the mayor's actions. "This so-called investigation is nothing more than a personal vendetta," Lawson declared, his voice dripping with self-righteous indignation. "Mayor Wright is tearing this city apart for his own political gain." The words stung, not because they were true, but because Daniel knew they would resonate with those who were already on edge. The city was divided, the protests outside City Hall growing more volatile by the day. One side called for sweeping reforms, chanting slogans of justice and accountability. The other side, galvanized by the police union's rhetoric, accused Daniel of putting their lives at risk. The tension boiled over one night when a small group of counter-protesters clashed with reform advocates, leaving several injured. The footage dominated the news cycle, with pundits blaming Daniel for the chaos. Inside City Hall, the atmosphere was equally fraught. Daniel's staff worked tirelessly, but the pressure was taking its toll. Susan Miller, his chief of staff, looked more exhausted with each passing day, her once crisp suits now wrinkled from endless hours at the office. Camille Torres, the brilliant data analyst who had unearthed so much of the department's corruption, had started receiving death threats, forcing her to take a leave of absence. Even Elijah Grant, the unflappable civil rights attorney, seemed unusually tense as he prepared for the upcoming legal battles. One evening, as Daniel reviewed the latest draft of his proposed police reform bill, Susan entered his office with a grim expression. "We've hit a wall," she said, placing a thick folder on his desk. "The unions have filed an injunction to block the bill. They're claiming it violates their collective bargaining rights." Daniel skimmed the legal jargon, his frustration mounting. The bill was the culmination of weeks of work, a comprehensive set of reforms aimed at increasing accountability and transparency within the police force. Body cameras for all officers, independent oversight committees, and mandatory bias training were just the beginning. But now, even before it could be debated, it was under attack. "We'll fight it," Daniel said firmly. "They're scared because they know this will work." Susan hesitated. "There's more. Lawson is pushing for a recall vote. He's claiming you've lost the public's trust." Daniel leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him. A recall vote would be a direct threat to his position, one that could derail everything he'd worked for. But even more than that, it was a signal that his enemies were willing to stop at nothing to see him fail. That night, Daniel stayed in his office long after the building had emptied. He stared out the window at the city he had sworn to serve, its twinkling lights masking the turmoil brewing below. He thought about the people who had believed in him, who had elected him to bring change. He thought about the faces of those who had come forward to share their stories of police abuse, their voices trembling with the hope that someone was finally listening. He thought about his son, who had once asked him, "Dad, why do people hate us just for being us?" The next morning, Daniel addressed his staff. His voice, though weary, carried a renewed determination. This fight was never going to be easy. He began, "And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tired. But this isn't about politics. It's about justice. It's about making sure no one else has to live in fear of the people who are supposed to protect them. If they want to come after me, let them. I didn't run for mayor to play it safe. I ran to make a difference." His words sparked a ripple of energy through the room. Susan straightened her shoulders, her resolve returning. Elijah nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. Even Camille, who had come in despite her leave, looked up from her laptop with a glimmer of hope. But as Daniel walked back to his office, he knew the hardest battles were yet to come. The personal toll, the political attacks, the unrelenting pressure, it was all part of the cost of change. And though the path ahead was steep and uncertain, Daniel was prepared to climb it. For his family, for his city, for justice. The energy in the city shifted as the fight intensified. What had begun as a personal ordeal for Mayor Daniel Wright had grown into a movement that no one could ignore. Across the city, citizens began to take sides, their voices rising louder with each passing day. Daniel, though embattled on all fronts, knew that true change would only come if he could harness the collective will of the people. He wasn't just fighting for justice in the police department, he was fighting for the soul of the city. The first rally Daniel attended as part of the reform effort was organized in the heart of downtown, in Freedom Plaza, where decades earlier civil rights activists had marched for equality. The plaza was packed with people of all backgrounds, young and old, black, white, Latino, and Asian, waving signs and chanting for change. Daniel stood in the crowd, surrounded by the same people who had elected him, their trust evident in their eyes. A young woman named Alicia, a community organizer, stepped up to the microphone first. Her voice rang out, fierce and unyielding. "For years, we've been told to stay silent. We've been told to wait for change. Well, we're done waiting. Mayor Wright is fighting for us. And it's time we fight alongside him." The crowd erupted in cheers, their chants echoing off the surrounding buildings. No justice, no peace. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he climbed onto the makeshift stage, his heart pounding. This was no longer about policy or politics. This was about connecting with the people who were counting on him. He looked out over the sea of faces, each one filled with hope, anger, or determination. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying over the noise, "I stand before you not just as your mayor, but as a father, a husband, and a man who has lived through the same fears and frustrations you feel. What happened to me at the mall wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system that has failed us all. And let me be clear, I will not stop until we fix it." The crowd roared in agreement, their applause mingling with chants of his name. But Daniel wasn't finished. "This fight isn't just mine. It's yours. It's ours. If we want real change, we need to make our voices heard, not just here, but in every corner of this city. We need to stand together, stronger than ever, because they can ignore one man, but they can't ignore all of us. That rally marked the beginning of a new chapter in the movement. Over the weeks that followed, the momentum grew. Community groups organized marches, sit-ins, and town halls, ensuring the conversation about police reform stayed at the forefront. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #ReformNow, amplifying the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. Daniel's team worked tirelessly to keep up with the groundswell of support. Susan Miller, his chief of staff, coordinated with activists to ensure every event was peaceful and organized. Elijah Grant, the civil rights attorney, held workshops on the proposed reforms, explaining them in simple terms so the public could rally behind them with confidence. Camille Torres returned to work, her fear overshadowed by her determination, and created data-driven infographics that showed the shocking disparity in policing outcomes across racial and economic lines. One particularly moving moment came during a town hall meeting held in a church basement on the city's south side. The room was packed, the air thick with emotion as people shared their stories. A middle-aged black man named Terrence stood up, his voice trembling. "My son was only 15, he said, holding back tears. He was walking home from basketball practice when a cop stopped him for no reason. They said he fit the description of a suspect. He didn't even make it home before they put him in handcuffs." He paused, his shoulders shaking. "That boy was my whole world. And now he's scared to leave the house. How is that right?" The room fell silent, the weight of Terrence's words pressing down on everyone. Daniel, sitting in the front row, felt his chest tighten. He stood up and approached the man, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your son's story is why we're here," Daniel said, his voice steady. "No child should grow up in fear of the people who are supposed to protect them. And I promise you, we will not rest until we make this right." Terrence nodded, his tears turning into quiet determination. The room erupted into applause. The people buoyed by the mayor's compassion and resolve. It was moments like these that reminded Daniel why he had chosen to fight. Despite the personal and political costs. But not all the feedback was supportive. Counter-protests grew louder, with police unions and their supporters accusing Daniel of vilifying officers and undermining public safety. "We risk our lives every day," one officer shouted during a televised debate. "And now this mayor wants to treat us like criminals." Daniel responded calmly, his voice firm. "This isn't about vilifying anyone. It's about accountability. No one, not even those in uniform, is above the law. This is about building a system that protects both the community and the officers who serve it." The clash of opinions played out across the city. In homes, workplaces, and schools, families argued over dinner tables. Neighbors debated on front porches. And friendships were tested. But through it all, Daniel remained focused on uniting the community. He understood that real change required not just policy but also cultural transformation, a shift in how people thought about justice, safety, and accountability. One of the most powerful moments of the movement came during a candlelight vigil held to honor those who had suffered from police misconduct. Hundreds gathered in the park, their faces illuminated by flickering flames. As names were read aloud, names of those who had been wrongfully arrested, injured, or killed, tears flowed freely. Daniel stood at the front, holding a candle of his own. When the last name was read, he addressed the crowd, his voice heavy with emotion. "Tonight, we remember those we've lost, not just their lives, but their dignity, their freedom, their trust in a system that failed them. But we also remember why we fight. We fight so that no more names are added to this list. We fight because their stories deserve justice. And their families deserve peace." The crowd held up their candles, a sea of light cutting through the darkness. In that moment, Daniel felt the strength of the people behind him. The fight was far from over. But together, they were unstoppable. The courthouse was alive with tension. Outside, protesters gathered in droves, their chants echoing off the marble steps. "Justice for all. No more silence." News vans lined the street, their cameras trained on the imposing building as reporters narrated the day's significance. Inside, Mayor Daniel Wright sat in a packed courtroom, his presence a testament to the stakes of the trial. This wasn't just about Randall Stone. It was about exposing the deep rot in the city's police force and proving that justice could triumph over corruption. The prosecution's team, led by Elijah Grant, was ready. Elijah's reputation for dismantling systemic injustices was legendary, and his presence in this case sent a powerful message. Across the aisle, Stone's defense team, bankrolled by the police union, appeared equally formidable. They had hired a high-profile attorney, Victoria Banks, known for her sharp wit and ruthless tactics. The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would captivate the city. As the trial began, Victoria's strategy was clear: shift the narrative. From her opening statement, she painted Randall Stone as a dedicated officer who had been unfairly targeted in a politically motivated witch hunt. She dismissed the mayor's assault as an unfortunate misunderstanding and accused Daniel Wright of exploiting the incident to further his own agenda. This case, she declared, her voice sharp and commanding, is not about justice, it's about politics, and my client is the unfortunate scapegoat. Elijah's opening statement struck a different tone. He recounted the events with precision, his voice filled with quiet conviction. This is not a trial about one man, he said, his eyes sweeping the jury. This is a trial about accountability. It's about a system that has failed to protect the people it serves. And it's about ensuring that those entrusted with power are not above the law. The first witnesses were bystanders who had recorded Stone's assault on Daniel. Their testimonies were damning, each recounting the aggression and prejudice they had witnessed that day. One young woman, a college student named Mia, described the moment Stone shoved Daniel to the ground. "I'll never forget the look on his face," Mia said, her voice trembling. "It was like he didn't see a human being. He just saw someone he thought didn't belong." Victoria tried to discredit Mia, implying that her testimony was influenced by social media and public pressure. But Mia stood her ground, her voice steady as she replied, "I know what I saw. And it was wrong." Next, Elijah called James Porter, the whistle-blowing officer, to the stand. Porter's testimony was pivotal. He recounted years of misconduct he had witnessed within the department, detailing how Stone and other officers operated with impunity under the protection of Captain Marcus Reed. The courtroom hung on his every word as he described the culture of silence that had allowed abuse to flourish. Every time someone filed a complaint, it disappeared, Porter said, his voice heavy with regret. It didn't matter how serious it was. If it was against one of Reed's guys, it went nowhere. Victoria's cross-examination was brutal. She questioned Porter's motives, suggesting he was testifying out of resentment or a desire for attention. But Porter remained steadfast, his voice rising with quiet anger. "I'm here because I couldn't stay silent anymore. People deserve to know the truth." As the trial progressed, the evidence mounted against Stone. Camille Torres's data analysis revealed a pattern of racial bias in his arrests, supported by internal records that showed a disproportionate number of complaints from minority communities. Elijah presented these findings with unflinching clarity, each statistic painting a damning picture of Stone's actions and their impact on the community. But the defense was relentless. Victoria called several of Stone's colleagues to testify, portraying him as a hard-working officer who had been unfairly targeted. One officer, a longtime friend of Stone, described him as a man who always put his life on the line for the people of this city. Under cross-examination, Elijah dismantled these portrayals with precision. He presented the jury with evidence of the emails Stone had exchanged with Reed, which outlined coordinated efforts to suppress complaints and intimidate witnesses. The courtroom fell silent as Elijah read aloud one particularly chilling message from Stone to Reed: "Don't worry. I'll make sure this one goes away like the others." When Stone himself took the stand, the tension in the room was palpable. His demeanor was a mix of defiance and desperation as he tried to explain his actions. "I was doing my job," he said, his voice shaking. "It wasn't about race. It was about enforcing the law." Elijah approached him calmly, his questions cutting through Stone's defenses like a scalpel. "Is that why you referred to Mayor Wright as one of them in your report? Is that why you ignored every attempt he made to de-escalate the situation?" Stone faltered, his carefully rehearsed answers crumbling under Elijah's relentless scrutiny. By the end of his testimony, the cracks in his story were evident to everyone in the room. As the trial neared its conclusion, Daniel took the stand. His testimony was not about vengeance but about the broader implications of the case. He recounted the assault with clarity and dignity, his voice filled with resolve. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Daniel said, addressing the jury directly. "It's about what happens to countless others who don't have the privilege of their voices being heard. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their rank or uniform, is above the law." In her closing argument, Victoria tried once more to frame the case as a political ploy. But the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Elijah's closing argument was a masterclass in persuasion. He spoke not only of Stone's guilt but of the opportunity the jury had to send a message. "This case," Elijah concluded, "is about justice, not just for Mayor Wright, but for every person who has been silenced, ignored, or mistreated by a broken system. Today, you have the power to say, 'Enough.'" The jury deliberated for 2 days, the city holding its breath as they reached a verdict. When the foreperson stood to announce the decision, the courtroom was silent. "On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of misconduct in office, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant guilty." The room erupted. Daniel closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for the people of the city. For justice, for accountability. Outside, the crowd cheered as the news spread, their voices a triumphant chorus of hope. But Daniel knew the fight wasn't over. This was just one battle in a much larger war. As he left the courthouse, flanked by his team and greeted by the jubilant crowd, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change was coming, and he would see it through, no matter what it took. The morning of the verdict dawned with an uneasy stillness. Across the city, people waited with bated breath, glued to their televisions, radios, and phones. The trial of Randall Stone had become more than a courtroom drama. It was a symbol of the city's reckoning with its past, its present, and the hope for a better future. For Daniel Wright, it was the culmination of weeks of grueling effort, emotional exhaustion, and unwavering determination. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. The packed gallery buzzed with murmured conversations, hushed speculation about what the jury's decision would mean. Daniel sat at the front, flanked by his team. To his left, Elijah Grant exuded quiet confidence, his hands clasped on the table before him. On the other side of the courtroom, Randall Stone sat stiffly, his face pale and drawn. Gone was the smug bravado he had displayed in the early days of the trial. In its place was a nervous rigidity, as if he were bracing himself for the inevitable. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Every movement seemed magnified, the shuffle of papers, the clearing of throats. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a steady gaze, stood to deliver the verdict. "On the charge of assault," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "we find the defendant guilty." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Daniel's chest tightened, his emotions swirling in a mixture of relief and validation. But the foreperson wasn't finished. "On the charge of misconduct in office, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant guilty." The room erupted, gasps gave way to cheers, and the sound of applause filled the space as though years of pent-up frustration and pain had found release in this moment. Reporters scrambled to capture the scene, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping as they described the historic decision. Randall Stone's face crumpled, his once stoic demeanor breaking as reality set in. His attorney, Victoria Banks, leaned in to whisper something, but he barely seemed to register her words. Across the courtroom, Daniel sat motionless, letting the weight of the moment wash over him. It wasn't just about Stone's guilt, it was about the system that had protected him for so long finally being held accountable. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel stepped outside to address the crowd that had gathered. The plaza was packed with supporters, their cheers echoing through the air. Signs waved, some bearing his name, others declaring, "Justice at last." Daniel took the microphone, his voice carrying with a quiet strength that silenced the crowd. "Today is not just a victory for me," he began. "It is a victory for every person who has ever been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. It is a victory for those who have fought for justice and accountability in the face of overwhelming odds. But let us be clear, this is just the beginning." The crowd erupted again, but Daniel raised his hand, signaling for calm. True justice is not just about one verdict. It's about building a system that ensures fairness for all. It's about holding ourselves accountable to the ideals we claim to stand for. That work starts now, and it will take all of us. His words resonated deeply, drawing tears and applause from the crowd. For a brief moment, the city felt united, bound by a shared sense of purpose and hope. But as Daniel returned to his office later that day, he knew the challenges ahead would be immense. Stone's conviction was a symbolic victory, but it had also drawn battle lines more clearly than ever. The police union had already issued a scathing statement, condemning the trial as a politically motivated attack on law enforcement. Conservative media outlets were amplifying the message, accusing Daniel of being anti-police and predicting a rise in crime as a result of his reforms. Even within City Hall, resistance was mounting. Council member Eric Lawson, emboldened by the union's rhetoric, called an emergency session to challenge Daniel's reform agenda. Mayor Wright's actions have jeopardized the safety of our citizens, Lawson declared in a press conference. We need leadership that supports our officers, not one that demonizes them. Daniel's team worked late into the night, preparing to counter the opposition. Susan Miller, ever the strategist, outlined a plan to mobilize community support for the next phase of reforms. We have the momentum, she said, her tone firm, but we can't let up now. We need to show the city that this isn't about dismantling public safety, it's about rebuilding it. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Daniel appeared on national news programs, articulating his vision for a police force that was both effective and accountable. He visited neighborhoods that had long felt neglected, listening to residents' concerns and assuring them that their voices were at the heart of his reforms. At every step, he faced resistance, protests organized by the union, hostile questions from certain reporters, but he refused to back down. The turning point came during a televised town hall. Daniel faced a room divided, one half filled with reform advocates, the other with police officers and their supporters. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken anger and mistrust. One officer, a young woman named Rachel, stood up to speak. I became a cop to make a difference, she said, her voice steady but emotional. But lately, it feels like we're being painted as the enemy. How can I do my job when the city I serve sees me as part of the problem? Daniel met her gaze, his tone sincere as he replied, Rachel, I understand how you feel. This isn't about demonizing officers like you who joined the force for the right reasons. It's about ensuring that the bad actors don't overshadow the good. Accountability isn't a punishment, it's a promise to the community that we can be better. His words struck a chord, softening some of the tension in the room. It was a small victory, but an important one. Slowly, Daniel began to see cracks in the opposition's armor. Some officers, tired of being associated with corruption, started voicing their support for the reforms. Community leaders who had been skeptical of his approach began to rally behind him. Stone's conviction became a rallying point, a reminder that change was possible, even in the face of entrenched power. For Daniel, it was proof that the fight for justice, though grueling and often thankless, was worth every sacrifice. And as he stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing yet another crowd of supporters, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. We've come a long way, he said, his voice steady and strong. But the journey isn't over. Together, we will build a city that lives up to its promise, a city where justice and equality are not just ideals, but realities. This is our moment. Let's make it count. The days following the verdict were a whirlwind of emotion and activity. Mayor Daniel Wright knew the fight wasn't over. Randall Stone's conviction had sent shockwaves through the city, but it was just one man in a system that had been failing for decades. If true change were to come, the momentum had to be channeled into action. Daniel's reforms, once just an idea, were now a battle plan, one that would reshape the city's police force from the ground up. The reform bill, dubbed the Community Accountability and Trust Act, became the cornerstone of Daniel's efforts. It was comprehensive and ambitious, proposing changes that would address the root causes of corruption and mistrust in law enforcement. Among its key provisions were independent oversight committees, civilian-led boards to investigate allegations of police misconduct, mandatory body cameras to ensure transparency and accountability during all interactions with the public, bias and de-escalation training, required courses for all officers, focusing on eliminating racial prejudice and promoting nonviolent conflict resolution. Community policing programs, initiatives aimed at building trust between officers and the neighborhoods they serve. Whistleblower protections, safeguards for officers who exposed corruption within the department. Daniel presented the bill to the city council in a packed chamber, the room buzzing with tension. Supporters of the reforms filled one side of the gallery, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability now." On the other side sat uniformed officers and their allies, their expressions a mix of skepticism and defiance. Daniel stood at the podium, his voice calm but resolute as he addressed the council. "This bill is not about punishing our police force," he began, his gaze steady. "It's about creating a system that works for everyone, officers and citizens alike. We cannot afford to let fear and mistrust continue to divide us. These reforms are a step toward healing, accountability, and, ultimately, safety for all." As he spoke, he recounted the stories he had heard over the past weeks, stories of families torn apart by injustice, of officers who felt betrayed by a corrupt system, of neighborhoods yearning for peace. "This is not just about policy," he said, his voice rising with emotion. "This is about people. About dignity, about doing what is right." The council debate was heated. Eric Lawson, Daniel's most vocal opponent, wasted no time attacking the bill. "These reforms are an overreach," he declared, his voice booming. "They will tie the hands of our officers and make it impossible for them to do their jobs. Crime will rise, and our citizens will suffer." But Daniel was prepared. With data provided by Camille Torres, he countered Lawson's claims, showing how similar reforms in other cities had led to decreases in both misconduct complaints and violent crime. He emphasized the need for trust between law enforcement and the communities they served, arguing that accountability was the foundation of effective policing. The council meeting stretched late into the night, the atmosphere thick with tension. Outside, protesters on both sides clashed, their chants filling the air. Inside, the vote finally took place. One by one, council members cast their ballots. When the final tally was announced, 7 in favor, 4 against, the chamber erupted. Supporters cheered, their voices echoing through the halls. The bill had passed, but the victory was only the beginning. Implementing the reforms would require navigating a labyrinth of bureaucracy, resistance from the police union, and logistical challenges. Daniel knew that each step forward would be met with pushback, but he was determined to see it through. One of the first challenges came from the union itself. They filed a lawsuit to block the reforms, claiming they violated collective bargaining agreements. The case dragged on for weeks, the city's progress hanging in the balance. During this time, Daniel faced relentless criticism from conservative media outlets and political adversaries, who painted him as anti-police and accused him of jeopardizing public safety. Amid the chaos, Daniel found strength in the community. He attended town halls, listened to residents' concerns, and worked tirelessly to build bridges between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. At one such meeting, held in a community center in a historically underserved area, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins stood up to speak. "I've lived in this city for 70 years, she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've seen it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I've seen mayors come and go, promising change but delivering nothing. But you, Mayor Wright, you've shown us that change is possible. Don't let them stop you." Her words brought tears to Daniel's eyes. "I won't, Mrs. Jenkins," he promised, "not as long as I have people like you standing with me." Despite the resistance, progress began to take shape. The independent oversight committees were established, their members drawn from diverse backgrounds to ensure fair representation. The first cases they reviewed exposed patterns of misconduct that had long been buried, leading to disciplinary actions against several officers. It was a watershed moment, proving that accountability was not just a concept but a reality. The rollout of body cameras faced logistical hurdles, but once implemented, they quickly demonstrated their value. Complaints about excessive force decreased, and the footage provided critical evidence in resolving disputes. Officers who had initially resisted the cameras began to acknowledge their benefits, both in protecting the public and shielding themselves from false accusations. Community policing programs also began to bear fruit. Officers were assigned to specific neighborhoods, encouraged to build relationships with residents and address concerns proactively. At first, the reception was mixed. Years of mistrust weren't erased overnight, but over time, bonds began to form. In one neighborhood, an officer named Malik Johnson became a local hero after organizing youth basketball games and helping to establish a community garden. But the path to reform was not without setbacks. The lawsuit against the reforms went to trial, and the union's lawyers used every tactic to stall progress. Tensions flared as some officers resisted the new policies, claiming they were being unfairly scrutinized. One night, during a heated council meeting, Daniel faced a room of angry officers who accused him of betraying the force. "I understand your frustration," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the hostility. "But this isn't about punishing good officers. It's about rooting out the bad ones so that the public can trust you again. These reforms are about making our city safer for everyone." His words didn't win over everyone, but they planted seeds of understanding. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, and the reforms moved forward unhindered. By the end of the first year, the results were undeniable. Complaints against the police dropped by 35%, and public trust in law enforcement began to recover. Crime rates, contrary to the union's dire predictions, remained steady, with significant decreases in violent incidents during police encounters. The city was far from perfect, but it was on a path to healing. One evening, as Daniel walked through a revitalized park that had once been a hotspot for tension, he was approached by a young boy holding a basketball. "Hey, Mayor Wright," the boy said shyly. "Thanks for making things better." Daniel crouched down, meeting the boy's eyes. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "People like you helped make it happen. Keep believing in change, okay?" As the boy ran off to join his friends, Daniel stood and looked out over the city skyline. The journey had been grueling, and the work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The system was changing, and with it, the city he loved so deeply was finding its way toward justice and hope. The soft glow of the city lights illuminated Daniel Wright's office as he stood by the window, gazing out at the streets below. It had been 2 years since the incident at the mall, the day that had set everything in motion, and the city was no longer the same. The echoes of protest chants had faded. The courtroom drama was behind them, and the reforms were no longer a mere vision but a reality. Yet, the weight of everything that had happened lingered, pressing on Daniel's shoulders like a silent reminder of the cost of progress. That evening, the city council was holding a celebration, a formal acknowledgement of the changes that had transformed the city. Invitations had been extended to activists, police officers, community leaders, and everyday citizens who had played a role in the journey. Daniel, however, had chosen to arrive late. He needed a moment to reflect, to process how far they had come. His gaze shifted to a photograph on his desk, a candid shot of his wife, Monica, and their son, Ethan, taken during a rare moment of peace at home. The image reminded him of why he had endured so much. The threats, the political sabotage, the personal attacks, they had tested him in ways he never imagined. But through it all, Monica had stood by his side, her quiet strength a lifeline when everything felt overwhelming. The knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Susan Miller, his chief of staff and the unyielding force behind so much of their success. She stepped inside, a rare smile on her face. "The council is waiting," she said softly. "The city's waiting." Daniel nodded, straightening his tie. "Let's not keep them any longer." As they walked to the chamber, the sounds of conversation and laughter grew louder. When Daniel stepped inside, the room erupted into applause. Faces turned toward him, some familiar, others strangers, but all united by a shared sense of accomplishment. For the first time in years, the city felt whole. The podium awaited him, and as he approached, the room quieted. Daniel took a moment to look at the crowd before him. He saw Terrence, the man who had shared the story of his son's wrongful arrest, now smiling with pride. He saw Officer Malik Johnson, the young cop who had become a trusted figure in the community. He saw Alicia, the activist whose voice had galvanized the movement, sitting beside Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who had given Daniel hope on his darkest days. "Good evening," Daniel began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Tonight, we gather not to celebrate one person or one victory, but to honor the resilience and strength of this city. 2 years ago, we faced a moment of reckoning, a moment that forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about who we were and who we wanted to be. And while the journey was difficult, we chose to face it together. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The reforms we've achieved are not the end of our work. They are the foundation for something greater. We've shown that accountability and justice are not incompatible with safety and security. We've proven that when we come together, officers, citizens, leaders, we can create a system that works for everyone. The crowd erupted into applause. But Daniel raised a hand, his expression turning more serious. But let us not forget the cost of this progress. Let us remember the stories that brought us here, the families who suffered, the voices that were silenced, the lives that were lost. Their pain is our responsibility, and their courage is our inspiration. As he spoke, his voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. This city has taught me that hope is not something we wait for. It's something we build, piece by piece, with our actions and our choices. And while we may stumble, while we may face resistance, we must never stop striving to do better. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, the applause began again, growing louder and more fervent until it filled every corner of the chamber. After the speech, Daniel mingled with the attendees, listening as they shared their stories and gratitude. Alicia approached him, her eyes shining. "You did it," she said, shaking his hand. "We did it." Daniel smiled. "This is just the beginning," he replied, "but it feels good to breathe for a moment." As the evening wound down, Daniel stepped outside for fresh air. The city stretched out before him, its streets alive with the quiet hum of life. He thought about the children who would grow up in a city where police officers were allies, not adversaries. He thought about the officers who now felt proud to wear their uniforms, knowing they were part of a system rooted in fairness and trust. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Turning, he saw Monica and Ethan approaching. Monica's warm smile was a balm to his soul, and Ethan ran to him, wrapping his arms around his waist. "Did you win, Dad?" the boy asked, his voice full of innocence. Daniel knelt, looking into his son's eyes. "We're winning," he said, "and we're going to keep winning, because we're doing what's right." As he stood, Monica slipped her hand into his. Together, they looked out over the city, a city that had been bruised but not broken, fractured but not defeated, a city that had chosen to fight for something better. In that moment, Daniel realized that his legacy wouldn't be written in laws or policies but in the lives of the people he served. The city's journey was far from over, but it was moving forward, driven by hope, justice, and the unwavering belief that change was possible. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt at peace.